Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the Curious Mind podcast. Today, I have a conversation with Jennifer Araneo, who is a mind-body guide in Hoboken, New Jersey. Jennifer uses different healing techniques and helps her clients to connect mind and body to manage stress and anxiety. Together, we discuss different approaches to work with clients, how we decide which approach to take, and our different perspectives on how to change stressful patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. If you want to get in touch with Jennifer, please visit mindbodyhoboken.com, and you can find this link also in the descriptions below. I'm grateful for Jennifer's time and interest in this conversation, and my thanks also to Amit, who is a mutual client of ours, and who helps to organize and structure our conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amit. I was born in India, moved to US for my undergraduate studies, worked with multiple financial companies. Last 3 years or so, I was in Warsaw, Poland, where I worked with Gabriel to help me out with some of my concerns with my parental issues, my health, and my life goals in general. Towards the end of my stay at Poland, when my health took a turn for the worst, I had to pack up and come back to US for certain medical procedures. That threw a monkey wrench into the otherwise planned and organized life, or as Gabriel says, reality hit us at that point. When I came back to Hoboken, New Jersey, I met Jennifer from Mind Body Hoboken, who then worked with me as I needed a lot of help with dealing with possibility of death, possibility of being disabled. And between Gabriel's logical view and reasoning and Jennifer's feelings and mind-body work, which is hypnosis, Reiki, past life, plus tons of reading on Buddhism and philosophy, I feel that I'm somewhat tranquil most days, or few days at least. So what I wanted to do today was I wanted to bring to you Gabriel's practice and how that is different than Jennifer's practice, and how I use the two combined to go through some of the tough times in my life. And I still continue doing that, every now and then. So one thing I wish was I would have reached out to them before. The only thing is, there's a lot of people who ask me, who I talk about Gabriel and Jennifer too, is how did you know who to get to? How did you know that was the right person? Were you comfortable, divulging your details? And yes, it is a little bit challenging. It was a little bit tough when I met Gabriel. It took me 2 to 3 sessions before I finally opened up. And I'll tell you a story about Jennifer on that. So, and I don't know if even Jennifer knows that, but before we go to Jennifer, the first time I met Jennifer, I went to her office. I went in with a lot of hesitation. I had no clue what this hypnosis was. I do meditation, but I never thought hypnosis would work. I wanted to give it a shot. I was like, worst case, what? I'm going to waste a session. Not a big deal, right? So when I met her, and before that, as an Indian male, if we cry, that's a sign of weakness, right? So crying means that we are weak, can't control ourselves. And in my last 15 years with my partner, I probably shed a tear once or twice when I got hurt or something, right? So that was that. But when I met Jennifer the first time, I walked in 30 minutes into doing our hypnosis. I was crying uncontrollably in front of someone I just met, right? I was as surprised while I was crying, but I couldn't stop crying. And I couldn't probably complete the session fully because I couldn't talk to her about everything that happened. But when I left the room, I was still in tears. But then at night, I slept very well, and I slept very well the following few nights as well. And when I went back to Jennifer, she said, well, there is a thing about your mind which logically agrees, but your body kind of like needs to feel that feeling or go through that feeling, and then you feel better about it. But then she stopped at that and she said, let's not go too detailed into why and what and what happened. So that was a little bit introduction about Jennifer. She made me cry. So on that, Jennifer, why don't we come to you? And as we come to you, you introduce a little bit about yourself and also tell us, why did you pick up a certain issue? I came to you with my health concerns, right? That was the most important at that time because I was going through a particular surgery and I had to go through a lot of other procedures. But you identified the issue with my mother, and you wanted to work on that, and you worked on hypnosis with that. So how do you, and how did you know that, okay, let me focus on the mother issue first, even though he has to go through a procedure? How do you pick and choose what to do? Do you read into it, or do you just go with your instinct? How does that work? And of course, starting with a little bit of your introduction first.
Okay, thank you. So I do Reiki hypnosis and meditation, past life regression, and I'll start from now, right? Is that I do find that the mind and the body are so well connected, and if, for example, people say, my mother did the best she could with what she had, but when she says this, my body reacts, right? Or when my dad says this, my body reacts. So I already have this, preconceived thing that there's something else going on, right? So, and I'm sorry if I'm like, I'm going to go back to the beginning. I read this quote, "The body achieves what the mind believes," in high school. I did a whole paper on it, a presentation on it, and I found that athletes were using their mind to help their body in performance states for sports or competition. I then took that and used it in college when I was a coxswain on the crew team. So, and I would take my teammates through these races before we would actually race, so that they would feel more confident. And by the time we got to the starting block, they had already done it. So the nerves they had weren't first nerves of doing it for the first time. And now this brings me to about 8 years ago. I was working with someone who did neurolinguistic programming, hypnosis, and energy work. And I found it to be so powerful for myself. And that's when I really felt that you can use this hypnosis or this meditative state, guided imagery, and for healing yourself versus for sports. And with this, with my mentor now, that's what I did. We did a lot of work releasing stuff that was, let's say, stuck in the body. And so now when I work with people, when they come in, you ask, how do I know where to go? Usually what people write down, that's their starting point. It's almost like their surface level. Like I'm coming in because I have a medical issue. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about the medical issue. And as they're talking, all this other stuff comes in. And usually when they're talking, that's where the light goes off in my head, where I say, okay, you came in with a medical issue, but you're not talking about the medical issue. You're talking about something else. And that's the access point. So what, sometimes it's a mother, sometimes it's not, it could be a dad, it could be a teacher, it could be anybody, but that's usually where I know to start. And then from there, what we did what we would call a regression, where you go into hypnosis, and it's not hypnosis like swing a pendulum, you're going to be out, you're going to have no idea what's going on. It's more of a meditative state where you close your eyes and you go within. And while you're within, that's when we go back in your timeline. And this is the really interesting space, is that because our body doesn't know time or space, in the same way, if I say, think of something that makes you really angry right now, something that happened like weeks ago, your body can get into that state, even though we're sitting right here and having this conversation, right? So we know that the body doesn't know time or space. So when you do the regression and you go back, we say, okay, go back to the first time you felt unloved, whatever it is, first time you felt rejected. And you go back into that state, whether it's a real memory or even a metaphor or whatever your mind is creating, your body thinks it's there. So it's able to re-experience, again, whether it's a memory or some version of that memory. And that's the moment you can access and start to empower yourself. So, some of the things we do, it seems really strange, and I get it, is that you go back as your adult self to help your younger self and give your younger self the tools that they need to get through that difficult situation. And when that happens, the body then switches. It's not going to hold on to whatever it was feeling at that moment. It kind of releases it in some way, right? Even though in your mind, you're like, what the heck is happening? And in your body has already been like, okay, I'm good now. So then you bring that healing up to the present, and people are usually like, what just happened there, right? And they're crying and everything. And what happened is that their body just released whatever it was holding on to, whatever belief they were holding on to. So there's a lot of ways to do it in the brain, with cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a lot of ways to do that. And this is the different way to access that, for them to release that belief about themselves. And that's usually where the crying comes in. Is there, I mean, I just want to make sure that I'm okay.
Yes,
for
I
time.
do have a couple of questions there. And Gabriel, I will be coming to you with this, right? So the questions I have is, so while you were doing this, right, while you were doing it with me, you kept asking me, Amit, are you in it or are you observing it? So one was that, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about why was there a difference with me being in it versus me observing it. And I think, I can't remember it, but if I were to recollect, I was mostly in it most of the time, which is where I wasn't able to talk to you a lot, right? I was feeling it, but I wasn't able to verbalize it. And the second thing you talk about is that your adult self helping your younger self. So my adult self, which is today at 40, helping my younger self, which was back then at 4, 5, 6 years. And you mentioned that there is no time, right? So can you elaborate a little bit about these two? And then Gabriel, I'll be coming to you with that as well to get your view on how Jennifer explains this versus how your theories work on it. So Jennifer, if you could just walk us through that.
Sure. So the reason why I ask if you're in it or if you're observing it, if you're observing it, then you're not going to bring up all the feelings as if you're in it. When you're when you are the 5-year-old or the 14-year-old and you're experiencing it, your body feels like your body is there, right? It's experiencing as the 5-year-old, right? But if you're just observing it, you're not really in it. So your body can't get that same reaction. You're just kind of watching somebody else go through something, which is different than experiencing it. So that's why we want to make sure that you're in it. So once you're in it, then you can experience what's happening at that moment. And then we do another thing where it's a little bit of a mind bend, is that we bring your adult self into it, right? So now you're kind of now you're in both pieces of it. Yours the younger self as well as your adult self. Again, your body doesn't know time or space, so it's happening at the same time. And I admit, it's totally bizarre, so I will say that. So what happens when your older self then talks to your younger self, you're able to get the feedback about what's happening in your body, right? So, you give your younger self whatever tools they need. They need to know that they're loved. They need to know that they're cared for, that they should be here. They deserve to be here. And then you can see the 5-year-old when they finally believe it. And and sometimes it takes a while, sometimes, and I'm just going to go a little bit further on this, is that sometimes you actually have to bring the 5-year-old into the future to see that he's going to be okay. And again, total mind bend, right? Because you're in the past and you're bringing into the future, which is still the past. And then when you bring the 5-year-old back, you ask, well, how's the 5-year-old doing right now? And you say, oh, the 5-year-old looks completely different. And they can see it in an instant. And that's what's really cool, is that everyone who does it sees it. They're like, oh yeah, I see it. He's released it now, or she's released it now. So that's part of like being in it and experiencing it with your body, and then as well bringing in your adult self who's also experiencing it. So and that's how it goes away, or you break through an old belief system.
Interesting. And the last thing before I get to Gabriel, so one thing you told me when you were explaining it, because I don't understand why it helped me sleep and get more relaxed. And you said something about your mind recognizes it, because working with Gabriel, I knew what happened. And, whatever incident that was that you took me back to, I joked about it with my friends, with my family. And, in India, you get slapped around all the time with your parents, right? It's not that uncommon. But how did that feeling that came through my body, or the shivering, or I wasn't able to verbalize it to you, how did that help? How is it like it's like naturally helps? Have you seen it helping? Or with me feeling that again at the age of 40, what I felt at the age of 5 or 6, how did that help me?
So I think a lot, what happens, right, is you experience something at 5, and that's how you learn about whatever that is. You learn about love, and I'm just using this as an example, right? And whatever it is that you believe about love or rejection, and then you still carry that around with you up until you're an adult. And so for some, you're still processing processing it like that, like the 5-year-old, right? Even though in your brain you understand, I am 40 years old, like this is what happened. It's not a big deal. This is what happens to everybody, right? But your body doesn't know that. Your body's still kind of like, no, this isn't, this doesn't feel right. So when you go back and you re-experience it, when you're in that state of when it's happening, that's the access point to go in and to heal it, because that's when it's happening and that's when you can interrupt it. You can interrupt what you believe about yourself in that moment. I do want to give you a really cool example, and I think I'm sure I shared this with you the first time you came in too, was I had a client who came in from the Bronx. He grew up in the projects. His mom was a drug addict. Oh, I think I froze.
No,
Did I freeze? Okay. Okay, so he comes in and he's got, he's depressed, he's got all the stuff going on. I said, all right, let's do, we're gonna do a regression. So we do this regression and we go back to the point when he was he was 13 years old and he was on the playground and he fell and he broke his teeth. And so here he is on the ground, crying, bleeding. There's nobody there to help him. His mom is not there. His dad wasn't there for a while. He's got like a stepdad, he's got 3 other kids, siblings, it's a mess. And he's crying and nobody can help him, right? So I say, okay, you're gonna go in right now and you're gonna go take yourself to the dentist. And he's like, this is so weird, there's no way I'm doing this. So just do it. So he finally gets himself to the dentist, gets his teeth fixed in the regression. We're in the regression. And so now that's fixed, he feels better. We fast forward to Christmas of that year because something came up at Christmas of that year, and his whole demeanor changes. And I said, oh, what's going on? What are you experiencing right now? He said, my teeth are fixed. I said, oh, okay, right? So we finish up what happened at Christmas, and then he finally gets out of it, and he's smiling, this like gigantic smile. And I said, what happened? And he said, what we just did, my teeth were fixed at 13. He said, I didn't fix them until I was in my 20s. These beautiful teeth. And he said, I could not see it any other way. He said, but I know in real life, when I was 13, my teeth were still broken at Christmas, but I could not see it that way. So that's it happened so quickly that now your memory has whatever happened in that has healed. Something has moved on from there. Your body's been able to release it. And yes, part of that release, some people have that visual moment. Some people release it through crying, through shivering. It might be just caught in your nervous system, and that's how it's releasing it. So I know I give you a really long explanation.
No, that was very good. I do have more questions, but before I confuse everyone then, so Gabriel, can we talk like 30 seconds about you? I mean, of course, you're a host of this podcast, so a little bit about you, and then I wanted to ask you questions in terms of what Jennifer did and what you would do in such situations, like when I came into you with certain concerns about my mother and everything. And Jennifer, then I'll come back to you because I read this in an Adlerian psychology that the past does not matter, and you were altering the past. So I would have a question on both of you for this one. So Gabriel, on to you.
Sure. Yes, so I'm a psychologist. I was interested in psychology since I was 16, and I went to the public library and read the collective works of Jung. And then I got into Freud, and then one thing led to another, and I decided to study it. So I dealt with that for a very long time. I think I'm quite unorthodox in that I don't care so much about the directions in schools and so on. I don't see myself as a representative of a specific school. I was kind of venturing into my own analyses of the mind pretty early on. And one aspect of that is that I got into meditation, and Buddhism, or historical Buddhism, which changed personally my life. And I spent a lot of time with meditation, and meditation also influence the way that I see the mind, because whenever you want to progress in meditation, or at least the Buddhist meditation that I did, you have to come to understand the different layers of the mind. There is something like a gradual progression, but at some point we hit a wall, and in order to get over this wall, we have to come to a very different understanding. There has to be an insight about what kind of structurally or conceptually this wall was, and with understanding it, there is a very specific kind of letting go and a very specific kind of overcoming this wall. And since that happens a couple of times, then this enriches our understanding of the mind and, you know, how it works and how it deals with things like fantasy and reality and all these things. So both kind of the long-term unconventional approach to psychology and this long-term dealing with meditation, Buddhism, but also Advaita and Hinduism and so on, I think brought me to the place where I am right now. There are a couple of things that I remembered while Jennifer was describing parts of her approaches, was that for a few years I was dealing also with symbolization. I don't know if that's a pretty good term in English. It was developed by a Swiss guy. It has a German name, Katatumes Bilderleben, which is the experience of symbolic images coming from the depth of within. And these are trance-like experiences where I think to a certain degree many of the phenomena that Jennifer mentioned as well occur also. So we enter a realm in which we experience ourselves symbolically, and what we experience there, and you know, with the way we can rectify things in the symbolic realm that have to a certain degree also effect on our everyday life when we come of this experience. It gives us a new narrative about ourselves. It gives us maybe an experiential access to a complex that we have or a very special trauma that we have, and we get like images, or we have experienced images to work with that, and we can use that to work with you know, notes that we take, the way that we go into daydreaming, we can bring up those images and so on. So it's a very fertile thing, and I can imagine that that the levels that Jennifer taps into with regression and hypnosis are not very, I know they're not the same, but that they might be kind of close by. It's a similar way of experiencing.
So Gabriel, just quickly, right? So when you talk about symbolic realm, is this the same as, let's say, someone's mother or father passes away and they have unfinished business with them? So you would then make them say, all right, you know, imagine your mother is standing here, now talk to her. Is that the symbolic realm that you're talking about?
It's more explicit than that, or it's more specific than that. So these things we can do, of course, but this specific method is bringing someone into a daydream state of mind. And then one impulse that we give is we suggest them to imagine some sort of landscape, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then we help them to stabilize this landscape. And then they tell us, and then we can, you know, we co-create it by asking, but actually they are creating it. So I can ask, they didn't pay attention to the grass, for example. I can ask them, how high are the blades of grass? Is it wet or dry? And so on. So effectively, they're guided by the questions to fill in the blanks that were not present while they had this first very vague idea of this landscape. But it becomes richer and richer, and I can ask, do you hear any birds? Are there any insects? How is the weather? What do you wear? And all these things enrich this, both enrich the experience and deepen this at medium level of trance. So in the full-blown kind of symbolic world experience, one is actually in a you know, mid-level kind of trance, because one interacts with oneself, with one's own mind, except for the communication that they do with the therapist or the guy who's facilitating the session. And then they walk around, and each step you take, you step on your own imaginary landscape. You step on yourself, you interact with yourself, whatever animal you see, whatever house you see, everything is you. Nothing is coming from the outside. So effectively, it's an experience. I experience myself on a symbolic level. So it's a greatly enhanced version of just imagine your mom and what you would tell her or something like that.
Wait, so this is Jennifer. Isn't this similar to what you were doing? You were taking me into this place where you asked me if there's a pond, you asked me if it is nighttime, daytime, dusk, dawn, things like that, and then you took me in. So how is that different than the hypnosis? You know, how is that?
So I think it's actually, I think what we're doing is actually very, very similar, a same tool. We're using a very similar tool, maybe just calling it something different. So when we go back into any sort of regression, or even if we do past life regression, the first thing I say is, look at your feet. Where are you? You know, and people look down and they'll see, you know, if they see grass, or ask, is it daytime or nighttime, so that they can actually be in the experience, whatever it is that they're experiencing. And sometimes we'll use that for past life regression, and sometimes we do that for future pacing to see where they are in the future. As well as if you want to bring up a relative who has passed, you could say, okay, they're sitting in front of you. Where are you? You know, and they'll say, okay, I'm in a park. Okay, well, are you sitting on the grass? Are you sitting on the chair? You know, so it sounds like we're using a very similar tool, maybe just calling it something different, but representing the same outcome, or looking for the same outcome.
Okay, so then, Doc, how come you never used that on me? I kept asking you, why don't you take me into hypnosis? And you said, no, I'm going to work with you in a different way. So why would you not do that with me then? Just out of curiosity.
I think over the years, my preferences changed, and I have a certain perspective of where I would like to go with my clients. And now with you, I worked for a longer time, and this is rather an exception. Usually I have more limited sessions with people, and they're interested kind of in solving a specific issue, and not so much interested in a larger self-development question, right? Which you have. You're interested in these topics, and you like to learn and to progress and so on. For me, in the big picture, I would like to work on establishing a big picture perspective that allows people to navigate, and not too much to solve with them the issues. For me, the solving of an issue is essentially to exaggerate, it's trivial, in the sense that, okay, when we solve that specific issue, and maybe I have learned a tool to deal with this specific issue only, then it's just a matter of time when something new hits me and I will not have the specific tool for that. And then I will be helpless again and kind of need to go to see someone who is a specialist in this thing. Now, of course, whenever we learn something, there's a possibility for learning an extra, a surplus experience, right? So when you go through something and you found a specific tool for the problem that you had, be it the stress at work, being it a relationship issue, there's usually a transfer where there's some sort of an aha understanding that automatically goes, you know, a level up. We understand, like, okay, now I know how I dealt with that, and I have a better idea now of how to deal with this class of experiences. So what I learned was not only to deal with one specific thing, and I would be helpless with any other situation, but I automatically learned something that is in the vicinity of the issue phenomena that I dealt with. So I learned not only to stand up to my boss, but I learned to stand up to all kinds of people through this treatment. And this is the direction where I would like to go with people, so that they develop a map that is more extensive than what they came from, and that they get as much as possible a broader understanding of the mind, of their mind, and maybe of the mind in general, so that they have more freedom to navigate. And personally, yes, I sometimes used this symbolic level with people, and it's good for certain things for me, but I aim at a different place. As you know, I'm quite structural in the way that I work with people, and maybe you can tell me from your experience. I guess you sense that I aim at something that is abstract and still affecting many situations, but often enough you couldn't really tell what this point is.
Yes, I'm usually leave your place confused. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I have to re-listen to it to figure it out. But then the thing is, what I found useful was, so basically this is how I work with you and Jennifer. So you give me an abstract view, right? You drive me to that view. Now with Jennifer, I would go to her and accelerate it. So what I would say is, Jennifer, I know that when my mother calls me, I don't want to get all upset, all hung up on the whole thing, because she'll say something or the other to trigger it. Reading Stoicism, it should tell me that I should not be worried about insults, and I should rather take it on a stride. Logically, that makes sense. But the minute the phone rings, it's all out the window. So then what Jennifer does with me is she walks me through the whole scenario. Okay, she called you now. She said this, she said that. How are you reacting? What is your reaction? And I feel that kind of gives me an accelerated fix to that particular problem, right? So although I know logically how I should deal with and how you gave me that approach, but with going through that phase or through that imagination, I'm able to then, when I call her next, be more prepared. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's how I kind of use the two of you, right? So does that mean that I'm using your logical, where you establish the big picture perspective, plus Jennifer's symbolic practice, and I'm combining it together, or maybe a combination of that can be helping?
Jennifer, would you like to comment?
Yeah. So what you're saying when you call your mom, you know, in the visualization, it's as if you're conditioning your body to already know what's going to happen, so that you're prepared for the response, right? So let's say he hears the phone ring, and the first thing I would say is, what's happening inside of your body? Where do you feel it? Like, where do you feel the angst? And, you know, let's say he says, okay, I feel it in my gut. Okay, all right. So then we would dive a little bit more into what's happening in your gut right there. What does that mean when she calls, right? And going through it in that sort of way, in the body's way, so that we can start to release that angst, that feeling that he gets in his gut. So now when his mom calls, you know, we get to the point where his mom calls, and he's not going to have that same response, because he'll go back to his big picture of, like, she is who she is, and that her behavior is not going to affect my life.
Right. So,
right, which seems to be more of the bigger picture, right? You don't want to react every time your mom calls.
Correct. And Gabriel, what do you think about it? Like, how would you say this is a good approach, or would you say that this is a temporary stopgap fix?
Well, everything depends on who is doing that. So you are well prepared, not just through me, but you are inclined to look for deeper answers in general. So I think your capacity to have a surplus understanding of what is going on is quite high. So I think your ability to benefit from this is quite good, actually. No, this is not the only prerequisite, I think, to get a good benefit. And I guess, or this would be a question for Jennifer, actually, how she understands people that she works with, what kind of approaches she uses with people who are kind of differently inclined. If she has a way to additionally explain things, or to take into consideration a greater variety of examples and situations when she feels that people are very narrow and would apply what she is offering them in a very narrow sense. I would assume that she has an antenna for that and slightly does different things, be it in the imagination or in the framing of it before that, or discussing afterwards, to make sure that this transfer that the transfer and the positive benefit of a treatment reaches, you know, and as far as possible in the mind of people.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of times I'll frame some of the stuff that I'm doing by the work of Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who deals with OCD patients in the US. And what he did was he found that, and I say this, I'm telling you what I tell them, just so, because I do have to frame it, is he found that OCD patients would go into a loop, a brain loop, so that he would scan their brains before, he would scan their brains during, and then after they went into this loop. And what he found was that they needed a roadblock. So once they get to the roadblock, right, I say, okay, when you're doing something different, you're going around the roadblock. So now your brain has to make different connections. So it can't get to that endpoint. It has to go somewhere else.
Right.
And then I also use the example about how your brain maps your body and how it maps your touch and everything, so that they're understanding how their brain is making these new connections, these new neural pathways. So they understand when they do the work, they're going to be making these new connections that's going to change their behavior. And they have to practice it, right? Because when you practice this new behavior, that really makes those pathways deeper and easier to access. So my example was, I had this woman who felt like she was becoming addicted to alcohol. And what we would do is we would go into the future to the next party she went to, the next time she went out with her friends, and how she would handle that within her body as well as mentally, right? So that she could get a better understanding of what was happening to her. Why would she go into this? And you know what we found out? She had fear of missing out. That was like her biggest issue, loneliness, right? So it comes down even deeper. So even in that work, you figure out what the core issue is. Even if we have to kind of do some other tweaking around other stuff, you really find out what the core is. So that's how I get them to, or I try to explain to them so that it translates further out, and it's not just for that one specific issue.
And how many sessions did it take you to help her with the whole fear of being an alcoholic?
Yeah, that took, she was with me probably for 12 sessions. Usually I see people around 6 sessions, so she was there for 12.
12. And okay, so before I get to my other question, Doc, so how would you work with this, right? So let's say if you got a patient who had a fear that they may be getting too attached to alcohol, like how would you work through that approach? You wouldn't do your symbolic realm, or maybe you would, but how would you approach it? Like how would you base what approach to take with them?
Yes, so in a general way, of course, we need the real person in front of us to be more concrete, but in a general way, what people say has relatively little relevance. It all depends on what they are not telling us, which belongs to the context of understanding, either which they are aware of or not, right? So the things that they are aware of, we have to ask, kind of how is it embedded in their state of mind? I'm afraid to become an alcoholic. What does it mean? Does she have an experience of people becoming alcoholics and this is what freaks her out? Was her dad an alcoholic, a grandfather, or did she get family stories about people who became alcoholics, which was then the beginning of the end of the family and the beginning of abuse and so on? You know, how is that anchored in her mind? It has a specific meaning. By itself, things have no meaning. Kind of a statement in itself has no meaning. It gets a meaning through the biographical, emotional kind of field in which this is planted. And in order to understand both the gravity and the kind of the neighboring issues and concepts, we have to investigate a little bit. We have to ask stuff in the fantasy, in biography, in family context, or at least this is what I would do. So I need to get a deeper understanding. I'm not satisfied with them just telling me what their perspective of what the abbreviated issue is. And in this process, I'm doing additional observations. So one of the observations is to get kind of a narrative understanding of where the issue lies. And that might be already, the most important clue. So maybe her horror vision lies in the family story, right? The father was an alcoholic. Her story is, I don't want to become like him. I don't want to become an alcoholic. And then it would be kind of important to show her the cracks in the narratives. Are you the same person? And how far are you observing kind of negative things happening when you drink more alcohol? Is that indeed worrisome? In which circumstances do you experience worrisome kind of effects of the alcohol, and which not? One of the things that I keep in mind is I want to be realistic with someone. When someone comes with unrealistic ideas, I'm kind of inclined to dismiss them. When someone wants to say, I want to never drink alcohol again, my first question is, do they live in a world where this makes sense? And most people don't. As you know, there are some cultures, where it's very uncommon to drink alcohol, be it some, Muslim countries, In India, it's largely kind of frowned upon to drink a lot of alcohol and so on. In the West, it's not. In the West, if you have kind of an average variety of friends, or you're not super spiritual or super something, then you're usually encountering often enough circumstances where it's normal to drink and where it's awkward not to drink. So if someone like that, who has a largely kind of average life circumstances, would come with a wish of, okay, I'm freaked out by the idea to become an alcoholic, so I never want to drink again, I would think that, okay, I might help them with that, but it's not sustainable, because the temptation over the next 10, 15 years to drink again at some, bar mitzvah or wedding or whatever it is, company festivity, is high. And then they will freak out because they're drunk again, and they will wonder, am I slipping now again into alcoholism? So we have to find something more sustainable that is able to accept some diversity and flexibility, and whereas a built-in mechanism, hopefully, that allows them to have a say in when to stop. Because usually what people are afraid of is that they come to a point where they don't know anymore what is good for them, and they cannot stop even though it's not good for them. So, as you see in this, when I go this path, it's already more obvious kind of what the issue would be. The issue would be the fear of losing control in this kind of specific narrative. It would not be the alcohol. When I identified that, it would be interesting, okay, do you have other fields of life when you have this, or is it limited? Then it, again, it's again a feedback loop to biography. So maybe alcohol was the one thing where people lost control. So this is why I think this is where people lose control. Hence, I don't want to lose control. Maybe it turns out that this is something that blocks them also in sex, blocks them also in enjoying their life, blocks them in kind of spending a little bit of money to, enjoy themselves. And they're always stingy because they're afraid that they cannot stop themselves to spend money on things and so on. So kind of when I found a theme that seems valid within their life, I'm interested in if this has some, metastasis in other fields of their life. So that ideally we would deal with it on a level that would have a satellite effect into all those different branches of experience. And if it's not, it's not, right? And depending on what the outcome is, I'm not kind of insisting that this would be the case. So maybe it's limited on alcohol. Maybe there is a path that Jennifer laid out. Maybe there's a lack of love or a fear of lack of love behind that, or something like that. But, nonetheless, ideally, we would come to some substantial level in which this particular manifestation, this kind of fear of becoming an alcoholic, makes sense from the perspective of the client. And we would deal with a more fundamental level that would alleviate not only this very specific complaint or fear, but something that enables them to enjoy themselves in a more, rich and complex way in general.
Cool. That was very good. Thank you. Thank you, Doc, for that. So last topic before we dismiss ourselves. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because of what Jennifer said, how she takes us back into our body, it takes us through that experience and so on. One of the things, I was reading this book on Adlerian psychology, right? And Doc, as I have talked to you before about Stoic, there's a lot of philosophy, psychology, all those, as you call it, bullshit sometimes. So in that book, Adler mentions, or, Adler's way of thinking is that the past does not matter. Right? So he makes this very bold statement saying, look, the past does not matter. Now, when I told this to my partner, she was like, what the hell is his problem? How come the past does not matter? Because and I was giving her an example that was in the book, that a dog bit you, or in Jennifer's case, that, the person lost his tooth. She took him back, and then he figured out that he fixed his tooth, and now he's happy, right? So in that case, the past did or did not matter, because he changed the way it mattered to him. And what Adler is saying is, whatever happened in the past, your view of the past, whether you look at it in a good way or a bad way, that matters. And where you're today matters, because if you're happy today, you will look at the past and be like, well, that framed me to be happy today. Versus when you are sad today, you look at it and say, well, this is what happened to me, so it mattered. Now, I'm not going to go into the simple cases. I'll just go directly into a case where she asked me a question and I couldn't answer it. Was, let's say she's walking down the street and she gets raped, right? Now, 2 weeks later, she comes to a philosopher, Adler, and Adler says, look, the past does not matter. So how would you work through that scenario? Or where are you placing yourself? Or would Jennifer work the same with this kind of a person who had a massive tragedy in their life, to walk that person through it in a good light? And how would you work through that, Gabriel? So which one were you going to start?
I don't know who you're addressing. Me?
Oh, okay. So let's start with you. Yeah, Gabriel, and then we'll end with Jennifer.
Yes. So I would need to see the larger context in which Adler allegedly said that the past does not matter, because it can be understood in many different ways. And Adler himself indeed had some context in which the past mattered a lot. He had the idea of insufficiency, which is one of his more kind of important concepts, insufficiency and inferiority, and that this comes from a certain point in time. It comes from early childhood, kind of 2 years old or something. Another idea that he was in fact one of the early psychosomatic psychologists, philosophers. So that it said that there is a kind of a deep connection between the mind and the body. This is also biographical in that sense. It happened at some point in time. So the question is, how is it meant? I can frame it in a way that I say, from my experience, it doesn't matter, or when someone tells me that happened 20 years ago, it shouldn't affect me anymore. This is, based on a very deep misunderstanding of the mind, because the mind indeed is not concerned with that. The mind has a very different wear and tear as physical objects do. We have a physical object, and then after 20 years, there's somewhat a predictable way in which it deteriorates. The mind has a very different and complex structure where we, in normal daily life and interaction with many different people, we do partial regressions. We activate and reactivate patterns from the past as if they are now, or maybe it's slightly reduced through other and mediated through other experiences that we had, but they're nonetheless triggered. So it's very easy, to give an example, to trigger experiences where we learned a specific interaction with our parents. Mm-hmm. And even 30 years later, they say one word, one sentence, and it brings us back to a similar place. And it feels fresh. It doesn't feel old and dusty and I'm over it, or why are you bringing this up? Like, that I'm over it for 50 years now or something like this. No, usually it feels kind of fresh, right? Especially if someone has not worked through their parent relationship. And this is a fundamental capability of our mind that is indeed not working with time in a way that physical objects do. There is a component of time, but it's much more non-linear as we're used to from living our everyday lives. What I mean with non-linear is that they have very different speeds, apparently, for different experiences, for different complexes. Some things change over time. Some convictions that I'm lovable, that I'm worth to be taken care of, that I'm capable of achieving something at work. These things can well change, right? So the work thing, we all start out with many insecurities. We compare ourselves. Now, in the fewest cases, this completely goes away, but there is a development there. Often in closer relationships with individuals, be it in intimate love relationships or in family or parent relationships, we tend more to regress in daily life, which means that we very quickly go back to a time that is very long time ago, and where the experiences that we made in between don't have such an effect on our capability to react in a regressive, which is childlike way, than in other fields where it's about money, love, money, career, our estimate of how well we can deal with stressful situations and so on, which usually show much more an effect of learned experience. So in that respect, I would agree with this aspect of the sentence, time does not matter, in that it does not matter fundamentally for how the mind processes experiences that we've been through. And so this is kind of a standard misunderstanding that many clients have, that they think that things that have happened long time ago shouldn't affect them anymore, basically only based on the argument that it's a long time ago. And this just shows that people don't have a good understanding of how the mind works. And one of the things that we should assure them is that the mind works differently, so that they learn that they have to take care of themselves in a different way than what they thought of before, that they have to take care of topics and complexes and not work kind of time-wise, not work on the things that seem the most relevant now and neglect the things that were important only 40 years ago. Or I barely see my parents now, so why should I, kind of deal with them? Why should I worry about the few times that I talk with them per year on the phone? Okay, I get upset and I'm upset for 2 days, but then I'm over it. Why should I take care of this, right? So this might be a position that people would have naively, and I think it's important to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of the mind, so for them to make a better choice of what to take care of and not.
Okay, so just before I get to Jennifer, so basically what you're saying is that, blasting a statement like the past does not matter is probably not the most relevant, because it matters in certain cases, it matters, in certain cases it may not matter as much, right? And that what you're saying is that you need to take care of certain issues that situation or the trauma that you went through, or maybe you thought it was a trauma, whatever it was that you went through something, you need to put some kind of a closure to it for you to be able to not react when something close to that comes up again in your life, right? And your way would be to work through it, to understand what it is, why it impacted you, where it impacted you, and where in the wider setting would it impact you in other areas as well, except for just that area.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, more or less, to add maybe a little bit. So sometimes people might have the idea, I'm not worthy of love. So I experience kind of difficulties in relationship. I have short-term relationships, or I have dissatisfactory relationships. And basically all the time I think that, I'm not worthy of love. Then in a certain, to talk about it in a relevant way, I'm interested in, okay, where might it come from? Not in a biographical sense that I'm interested in how, that it appeared, a certain time ago. I'm interested in providing a narrative that make people understand why it's functional, so that when I was raised by parents who didn't give me love, it's the most natural kind of conclusion that I internalize this view, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at this time, typically when I'm young, I don't have much say. I don't have built up, an exoskeleton, a character that in spite of the circumstances would tell me that I'm lovable. Usually we're just very naked and exposed to this kind of view. So to help people now when they're older to understand, look, this persistent view that you have comes from a time when you didn't have much say into it. And this is, when you were 4 or 5 years old. So in that sense, I incorporate a time perspective so that they understand, why is that so persistent in comparison to other things that I have successfully overcome. But I'm not interested per se in the time that has passed, right? It's a piece of understanding that is necessary so that people get this, oh, so this is why I have to take care of it in a fundamentally different way than just, learn a skill or do something small about it, as I did with these other things that I accomplished successfully.
Interesting. I need to have a session with you on the not worthy of love, because I think I still feel that. But that'll be a personal session later. But coming to Jennifer, coming to you, right? So we started with the whole thing where Adlerian psychology, on where he said past does not matter, to people getting upset with that statement, and then coming to what the doc has been saying about certain things that you need to get over with and get passed through. So how would you deal with such a situation, right? Or let's say if someone comes to you saying that they feel that they are not worthy of love. I think I did come to you with that. Where I said that, I feel like I need to start loving myself before I can stabilize, and also about the past and you changing people's past. So how have you worked through these situations with your clients?
I do think that the past does affect your present, because you do carry stuff with you, right? That's why we do that's why people do past life regressions. That's why people do any sort of regression, is to release whatever is inside of them. Some people do it, through talk therapy. Some people do it through this type of hypnosis where they can release it from their system, release it from their mindset in a different way. But and it's interesting because he said how we perceive the past, right? So if you perceive the past he's kind of saying the past matters, because if he's saying it's how you perceive the past, right? Is that correct that he said that?
Yeah.
Then how you're interacting with your parents in this moment is based on how you perceive the past, right? Because however they treated you is how now you're responding to them. So I would say, I agree with them in that regard, right? Which is really interesting, because then if you just say straight out the past is the past, part of neuro-linguistic programming and people who've studied Ericksonian hypnotherapy, how everything's around language, they would say the best thing about the past is that it's in the past. You have your entire future, present and future in front of you, right? You don't have to keep reliving it, which I do agree with that. I think once you do the work, it's done. And when we kind of keep trying to override the work that you've done, that's when I think people get into these, they get into conflict, and then maybe the work isn't done yet. There's still something that hasn't clicked. They haven't had their aha moment, or maybe they did, and now they have to have another one. Mm-hmm. So, so I do think it's kind of, the past does matter and how you perceive it, but I do think that you can get over it and move forward.
And that's
it doesn't have to sit with you for the rest of your life.
Right, and that's what you do with the whole past life regression and everything. And it may not be that you go into your past life if you don't believe in reincarnation or something, but it could be the present life or the present feeling that you bring out, right? And like what you did with my partner, where she had a really good past life regression with you, and whereas when I tried it, I didn't feel much from that. But with the hypnosis and all, I did feel quite a bit. Okay, so I think this would be pretty good. This gives a good view of the thought process that you have, the style that you have for working, Jennifer, and also Gabriel, in terms of your style. And I think for folks who are listening, can probably pick and choose which one they feel more comfortable going with. To begin with, I use both of you because I think it complements each other, so I can put it to good use. So that's about it. And thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Jennifer. So I think we can end this here. So Gabriel, you want to start recording, and then we can talk.
I would still like to add something, and maybe Jennifer afterwards as well. So maybe that was a little bit premature. I think, from the way that we commented, it's necessarily still relatively slim. I don't know if people who have, not had anything to do with psychologists or this kind of work, it might give a glimpse. And what I hope that people get is that things are complex, and when people come to us, I think we both look at some complexity of who is sitting there with what kind of beliefs, what kind of issues do they come with. I personally am not a big fan of kind of therapies that have a very standardized approach, where they don't look so much at these complexities, where someone tells us, oh, I have depression, and then I tell them, okay, then I know exactly what to do with you. Like, we do 8 sessions, and in the first 3 sessions we will do this, and then we will do that, and then we will do that. And there are people who work like that, kind of in a very mechanical way in therapy, which is a simplicity that is, I think, unfair to the complexity of the lives that people come to us with. So there's much, much more, both to my work and I'm sure to Jennifer's work, depending on what you come with. And maybe additionally, this could be a sign of quality when you visit a psychologist or someone that works with you on mental stuff, that you should look out for how much do they indeed pick up the subtleties of what I say. How much do they pick up the things that I did not mention but belong to the story. And this, as difficult as it is, I think, to find the right professionals for oneself, for one's tastes and so on, but I would take this as one of the kind of hallmarks of professionals that I would like to work with, because I don't see myself as kind of simple, and I would need someone who, to some degree at least, would be able to pick up on some complexities of what I come with. But I would be interested in Jennifer's perspective on this as well.
I love how you said the subtleties of what people say or don't say, because that's really the beauty in what we're doing is really picking up. You come in and you say, I'm depressed, right? And it's like, okay, well, why are you depressed? What are you depressed about? Are you ever happy, right? Versus sitting in depression with them. You're finding different ways to make them recognize that they're not depressed. And I'm just using this as an example because there's so many people, yes, the practitioner will go there with you in the depression. So to find the one that's actually going to pull you out of it, by seeing these subtleties, noticing that you made a comment about how you went out with your friends and you had a great time, and you say, okay, well, that's not depression. A depressed person wouldn't do that, would they? Right. And then you create confusion in their head. So the fact that you walk out of his office being a little bit confused is good, because then it has broken whatever pattern you were in. Right. So I think that's, I think that's great to either walk out confused or even walk out lighter. Right. So the difference that I have, and when people walk out of my office, is they feel lighter and sometimes confused, which I think confusion is great because it breaks patterns. And I think that helps people find their match. Right? Like if you're looking for change, then when you walk out of that office, you should feel something different than what you felt coming in. And if that's not happening, then it might not be the technique, it might be the person, or it might be the technique and not the person. Do you know what I mean? Like you do have to figure out who resonates with you and how they're resonating.
Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed to hear about our different approaches, and please again visit Jennifer at mindbodyhoboken.com.